Book name: The Quiet Glow, A Journey of an Introvert's Courage, which is written and published by Dr. Prashant. Overview: This book tells the story of Ethan, a deeply introverted yet thoughtful young man who feels invisible in a world that celebrates loudness and extroversion. Set in a small suburban town, the book explores Ethan's journey from self-doubt to self-discovery, showing how his quiet strength, empathy, and unique perspective transform his life and the lives of those around him. Through a series of heartfelt and relatable moments, Ethan learns to embrace his introverted nature as a gift rather than a limitation. Each chapter presents a defining moment in Ethan's life, from the struggles he faces in social situations to the triumphs he achieves where he begins to value his inner world. The story resonates with anyone who has ever felt overlooked or misunderstood, offering comfort and inspiration to introverts everywhere. Chapter 1: The Shadow at the Back of the Room. Ethan always sat at the back of the classroom, in the last row, near the corner. The seat was perfect for him. It felt safe, almost invisible. While other students chatted loudly before class, Ethan kept his head down, quietly organizing his notebook or doodling in the margins of his pages. He had mastered the art of blending in, and most days, it felt like the right choice. Ethan was not the type of student who raised his hand to answer questions. Even when he knew the answer, his heart would race at the thought of speaking in front of the entire class. What if his voice cracked? What if he said something wrong and everyone laughed? These thoughts would spiral in his mind until he convinced himself it was better to stay silent. His classmates, on the other hand, were like bursts of energy. There was Olivia, who always had her hand up with an answer, and Josh, who could make the entire class laugh with a joke. Ethan admired them from a distance, but never felt like he could be like them. Instead, he observed. He noticed the small things, like how Olivia twirled her pen when she was thinking, or how Josh always tapped his foot when he was bored. While most people thought Ethan was shy or uninterested, the truth was different. Inside, his mind was alive with ideas, thoughts, and stories. He often imagined himself as the hero of an adventure, fighting dragons or solving mysteries. But in real life, he felt too awkward and unsure to step out of his comfort zone. One day, during history class, the teacher asked a question about a famous explorer. Ethan knew the answer immediately. His fingers twitched as if they wanted to raise his hand, but he froze. A moment later, Olivia blurted out the answer, and the teacher smiled, praising her. Ethan felt a small pang of regret. It was not the first time he had let an opportunity pass by. At lunch, Ethan sat at his usual spot in the cafeteria, a small table near the window. He opened his sketchbook, letting his pencil glide over the page. Drawing was his escape. It was the one place where he could express himself without worrying about what others thought. He created a world of castles and forests where the characters were bold and fearless, everything he wished he could be. That afternoon, during a group activity in English class, Ethan was paired with two students he barely knew. As they brainstormed ideas, Ethan stayed quiet, letting the others take charge. But then one of them, a boy named Michael, noticed Ethan's notebook. "Hey, did you draw that?" Michael asked, pointing to a detailed sketch of a dragon. Ethan nodded, feeling his cheeks heat up. "That's amazing," Michael said, showing it to the group. For a moment, Ethan felt a flicker of pride. Maybe, just maybe, there was a place for someone like him after all. That day, as Ethan walked home, he thought about the shadow he always tried to be. Perhaps it was time to step into the light, just a little. Chapter 2: The Treehouse. Ethan's treehouse was his safe haven. It sat high in the branches of the old oak tree in his backyard, hidden away from the noise of the world. His dad had built it years ago when Ethan was little, but as he grew older, it became more than just a playhouse. It was a place where he could escape, think, and dream. Inside, the treehouse smelled of old wood and leaves. The floor was covered with a soft rug, and there were cushions where Ethan could sit for hours with his sketchbook. Sunlight streamed through the small window, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the walls. For Ethan, this space was perfect. It was quiet, private, and entirely his own. One warm afternoon, Ethan was perched on the floor, sketching the view from the treehouse window. He loved capturing the world outside. The tall trees, the birds flying by, and the way the sun glinted off the rooftops of his neighbors' houses. Drawing made him feel calm, like he was creating his own little world where everything made sense. As he added the final touches to his sketch, he heard something unexpected, a voice. Looking down, he saw a girl standing near the base of the tree. She had short, messy brown hair and a curious expression on her face. "Hey," she called out. "Is that your treehouse?" Ethan froze, unsure what to say. He wasn't used to talking to strangers, especially ones who seemed so confident. The girl didn't wait for an answer. Before Ethan could even think, she started climbing the ladder. His heart raced as she reached the top and poked her head into the small opening. "Cool place," she said with a grin, pulling herself inside. "I'm Lily. We just moved in next door." Ethan sat still, holding his sketchbook tightly to his chest. He wasn't sure how to react. No one besides his family had ever been in the treehouse before. "Do you live here alone or what?" Lily asked, looking around. Her eyes landed on his sketchbook. "What are you drawing?" "Just the trees," Ethan mumbled, feeling embarrassed. "Can I see?" she asked, sitting cross-legged across from him. Reluctantly, Ethan handed her the sketchbook. Lily flipped through the pages, her eyes widening. "These are amazing," she said, her voice full of genuine admiration. "You're really talented." Ethan wasn't used to compliments, especially from someone he had just met. He felt his cheeks flush and looked down at his hands. Lily stayed for a while, asking questions about his drawings and talking about herself. She told him how her family had moved from a big city and how she missed the noise and excitement. Ethan listened quietly, surprised at how easy it was to let her talk. When Lily finally climbed down the ladder, she waved and said, "See you tomorrow." As Ethan watched her walk away, he felt something strange. The treehouse, his quiet retreat, didn't feel as disrupted as he had feared. Instead, it felt warmer. For the first time, Ethan wondered if sharing his world with someone else might not be so bad after all. Chapter 3. The Unwanted Spotlight. Ethan had always disliked being in the spotlight. The thought of standing in front of the class, with everyone's eyes on him, made his stomach twist with anxiety. He preferred to stay in the background, unnoticed. That was where he felt safe. He had his sketchbook, his quiet thoughts, and a world of stories that only he truly understood. So when the teacher, Mrs. Collins, announced that she was assigning group projects, Ethan's heart sank. The idea of working with someone else was bad enough, but the worst part was that it meant he would have to share his work with the whole class. He wasn't good at speaking in front of others, and the thought of being the center of attention terrified him. To make matters worse, Mrs. Collins paired him up with Lily. Lily was the opposite of Ethan. She was outgoing, confident, and loved being the center of attention. She made friends easily, and she always had something to say. Ethan didn't know her very well, but he'd seen her around school. She was always laughing, always talking. She seemed to have no fear of being noticed. Ethan, on the other hand, always felt invisible. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, and he certainly didn't want to work with someone who thrived on being noticed. At first, Ethan thought about asking the teacher to switch partners. But as soon as he saw Lily's bright smile and heard her excited voice, he realized it would be rude to back out. Besides, Lily didn't seem like the kind of person who would let him hide in the background. She immediately took charge of the project, suggesting ideas and organizing everything. Ethan felt a little overwhelmed, but he was secretly relieved. At least Lily seemed to know what she was doing. As they began to work together, Ethan quickly discovered that Lily wasn't as scary as he had imagined. In fact, she was kind and easy to talk to. She asked him about his interests and listened to his ideas. She didn't pressure him to speak up or do anything he wasn't comfortable with. Instead, she encouraged him to contribute in his own way. They decided that Ethan would create the artwork for their project while Lily handled the presentation. This way, Ethan could stay behind the scenes and let his work speak for him. But when the day of the presentation arrived, things didn't go exactly as planned. As Lily stood in front of class, confidently explaining their project, she turned to Ethan and said, "And now, let's take a look at Ethan's amazing artwork." Ethan froze. The entire class turned their eyes toward him. His heart pounded in his chest, and his palms felt clammy. He had never liked being the focus of attention, and now it felt like everyone was watching him. His cheeks turned red as he stepped up to the front, holding his sketchpad. He felt his throat tighten, and for a moment he couldn't speak. Lily smiled reassuringly at him, silently telling him it was okay. Slowly, Ethan flipped open the sketchbook and showed the class his drawings. To his surprise, the class was quiet, watching him with interest. He could feel their gaze on his artwork, not on him, and that made it a little easier. He pointed to the details in his sketches, describing the characters and the stories they told. The more he spoke about his art, the more he felt comfortable. The spotlight wasn't so frightening when it was shining on his work instead of him. When they finished the presentation, Mrs. Collins praised their project, and the class clapped. Ethan felt a mix of relief and pride. He hadn't expected to feel good about being in front of everyone, but somehow he did. The spotlight, while unwanted at first, had helped him realize that he didn't have to fear it. He didn't need to be the loudest or most outgoing person to be noticed or appreciated. Sometimes, all it took was being true to himself and letting his work do the talking. From that moment on, Ethan began to understand that the spotlight didn't have to be as scary as he had always thought. He didn't need to seek out, but when it found him, he could stand at it with quiet confidence. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Chapter 4. The Library Whisper. Ethan had always found comfort in the library. It was his special place, where he could escape from the noisy world and enjoy the peace he craved. The library was quiet, the kind of quiet that allowed him to think deeply without distractions. As he wandered through the aisles of books, he felt like he was stepping into a world where he truly belonged. It was a place where no one expected him to speak, and he could lose himself in the pages of a book or in the drawings he loved to create. One afternoon, as Ethan was sketching in his favorite corner of the library, a soft voice interrupted his concentration. "Do you mind if I sit here?" the voice asked. Startled, Ethan looked up and saw Mr. Jacobs, the librarian. He was a gentle, older man with glasses perched on his nose, a friendly smile, and a calm presence. Mr. Jacobs was well known for his love of books and his kindness. He was the kind of person who would never rush anyone, who understood that some people, like Ethan, preferred to keep to themselves. Ethan nodded shyly, not sure what to say. Mr. Jacobs took a seat nearby, and they both settled into the peaceful silence, each immersed in their own world. For a long while, there was nothing but the sound of turning pages and the quiet scratch of a pencil against paper. Ethan was comfortable with the silence, and he was glad Mr. Jacobs understood. But soon, he felt a quiet curiosity from the librarian. "Those are some beautiful drawings," Mr. Jacobs remarked, glancing at Ethan's sketchbook. "What are you working on?" Ethan hesitated, unsure if he wanted to share his personal sketches. He was used to keeping his work private, afraid of judgment or criticism. But something about Mr. Jacobs made him feel safe. So, with a little push from inside, he showed the librarian the page he had been working on. Mr. Jacobs studied the drawing for a few moments, his eyes brightening. "You have a real talent, Ethan. Have you ever thought about doing more with your art? Maybe even entering a competition?" The idea of entering a competition had never crossed Ethan's mind. He had always been content to draw for himself, without seeking anyone's approval. But Mr. Jacobs's words planted a seed of doubt in his mind. Could he really share his art with others? Was his work good enough to be seen by the world? Seeing Ethan's uncertainty, Mr. Jacobs smiled reassuringly. "I know it might feel scary to put yourself out there, but sometimes when we share our work, we connect with others in a way we never thought possible. Art has a way of speaking to people, even without words." For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a spark of courage. Mr. Jacobs's encouragement had opened up a new possibility for him. Maybe he wasn't just an introverted artist in the corner of the library. Maybe his art could have a place in the world, too. Over the next few weeks, Ethan returned to the library often, not just to draw, but to talk with Mr. Jacobs. They shared stories and ideas, and Mr. Jacobs gave him gentle advice about his art. The librarian became more than just a friendly figure in the library. He became a mentor, someone who believed in Ethan when Ethan wasn't sure he could believe in himself. Through these quiet moments in the library, Ethan began to understand something important. Sometimes, all it took was someone who cared, someone who saw potential in him when he couldn't see it himself, to help him take the first step toward believing in his own abilities. Chapter 5. The Competition. Ethan could feel his heart racing as the day of the art competition drew closer. At first, he had been excited when Mr. Jacobs, the librarian, suggested that he enter. He had spent hours carefully selecting his best sketches, drawing everything with the kind of focus that only came when he was in his own world. But as the competition date approached, doubt began to creep into his mind. What if his art wasn't good enough? What if no one liked it? These questions bounced around in his head, making him second-guess everything he had done. He didn't like being in the spotlight, and he certainly didn't like the idea of his work being judged by others. The thought of standing in front of a crowd and sharing his drawings made his stomach twist into knots. Lily noticed his hesitation. She could see that Ethan was struggling with the idea of putting himself out there. "You don't have to be perfect, Ethan," she told him one afternoon as they sat together on the grass behind the school. "You just have to be you. Your art is unique, and that's what makes it special." Her words helped calm his nerves, but not completely. Still, the fear of failure lingered. On the morning of the competition, Ethan almost decided to back out. He could just pretend he had forgotten to sign up, or say that he wasn't feeling well. But something stopped him. He thought about how hard he had worked on his drawings, how much effort he had put into each sketch, and how much Mr. Jacobs believed in him. With a deep breath, he grabbed his art folder and walked to the competition. When he arrived, the room was filled with other students, all of them chatting excitedly. Some were nervous, just like him, but most were confidently showing off their work. Ethan felt a wave of insecurity wash over him. Their drawings seemed so polished, so professional. He wondered if his own sketches were too simple, too childish. When it was his turn, Ethan stood at the front of the room, holding his sketches. The judge, a woman with short blonde hair and glasses, gave him a kind smile as she flipped through the pages of his art. "These are lovely," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "I see a lot of detail in your work. You have a great eye for capturing the little things most people miss." Ethan felt a rush of warmth spread through him. It wasn't a grand compliment, but was enough to make him feel seen. After the judge finished looking at all the entries, the results were announced. Ethan didn't win, but he did receive a special mention for his creativity. It wasn't first place, but it was still an acknowledgement that his art had value. As he walked back to his seat, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Disappointment, yes, a little, but also pride. He had done it. He had stepped out of his comfort zone and shared his work with others. And it felt good. In that moment, Ethan realized that winning wasn't the most important part. The fact that he had tried, that he had faced his fears, was the real victory. That day, Ethan learned an important lesson. Bravery doesn't always mean being the loudest or the best. Sometimes it means simply showing up and being true to yourself. Chapter 6: A Silent Victory. Ethan stood in the back of the art gallery, nervously twisting his hands together. The competition was over, and he had just learned that he didn't win. He felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. It was the first time he had shared his art with so many people, and despite not taking home the first prize, something inside him shifted. The moment he walked in, Ethan had been overwhelmed by the number of people in the gallery. It was buzzing with energy. People laughed, talked, and admired the colorful art on display. But Ethan felt like a ghost, trying to disappear in the crowd. His heart beat loudly in his chest as he looked at his sketch hanging on the wall, surrounded by other pieces full of bright colors and bold designs. His drawing was different. It wasn't as bright or loud as the others. It was quiet, filled with delicate details and soft lines. It was the kind of artwork that needed time to be understood. As Ethan wandered through the gallery, his mind kept racing. He couldn't stop thinking about how his drawing seemed to fade against the more attention-grabbing pieces around it. Maybe it wasn't good enough. Maybe it was too simple. Maybe no one would see it for what it was. But then something unexpected happened. A couple of visitors walked by, and one of them paused in front of his sketch. She studied it for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edges of the lines in the air. "This one," she said, "it feels like it tells a story." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had never thought of his art as telling a story. To him, it was just a collection of lines and shapes he had created to make sense of his thoughts. But hearing it from someone else made him realize that perhaps his art was more than he had given it credit for. As the night went on, more people stopped to look at his sketch. They didn't talk loudly or make a big fuss, but their interest was clear. Some even came back to look at it again. By the end of the evening, one of the judges approached Ethan and told him that his work had been one of the most memorable of the competition. Although he hadn't won the top prize, the judge's words meant more to him than any trophy. Ethan had a small victory that night. It wasn't about winning the competition or receiving applause. It was about realizing that his quiet, detailed art had made an impact. He didn't need to be loud or flashy to be noticed. The soft lines of his sketch spoke for themselves. Later, when he returned home, Ethan sat on his bed, still processing the evening. He thought about how his art, which once felt like a secret part of him, had now been seen by others. It was the beginning of a new understanding for Ethan. He realized that sometimes the quietest things leave the biggest impact. That night, he promised himself he would never be ashamed of his quiet nature again. He understood now that his introversion wasn't a flaw. It was his way of seeing the world in a deeper, more thoughtful way. His victory wasn't in the loud applause of others. It was in the quiet recognition of his unique voice. Chapter 7: Finding His Voice. Ethan had always been the quiet one. He spent most of his time drawing and observing, finding comfort in the stillness of his thoughts. He never felt the need to speak up much. Words didn't come easily to him, and when he did speak, he often felt misunderstood. But through his art, Ethan realized there was a way to express himself without needing to say much. After his success in the art competition, Ethan began to see things differently. For the first time, he felt proud of his work and started to believe that he had something valuable to share. He wasn't just the quiet boy anymore. He was someone with talent and stories to tell, even if those stories were told through sketches and drawings instead of words. One day, while sitting in the school library with Mr. Jacobs, the librarian, Ethan had an idea. Mr. Jacobs was the first person who truly understood his love for art and the way it spoke for him. He often encouraged Ethan to be brave, to share his drawings with others. "Your art isn't just for you, Ethan," Mr. Jacobs told him. "It's meant to be shared. You have a voice, even if it's quiet, and the world needs to hear it." Mr. Jacobs's words stuck with Ethan. He had always kept his art to himself, but what if he could share it in a new way? He decided to start small, by submitting one of his sketches to the school newspaper. At first, the thought made him nervous. What if no one liked it? What if they laughed at him? But after thinking about it for a while, he realized that he didn't need everyone to like his art. He only needed to believe in it himself. The day the newspaper was published, Ethan felt a mix of excitement and fear. He knew that his drawing was now out in the world for everyone to see. He couldn't take it back, but he was proud of it. To his surprise, people complimented him on his work. His classmates told him how they saw the story in his drawings, how his art made them feel something. For the first time, Ethan felt like his quietness wasn't a weakness. It was his strength. He had found a way to speak without saying a word. His drawings did the talking for him, telling stories that were as meaningful as any spoken conversation. The more Ethan shared his art, the more he realized that finding his voice wasn't about being loud or speaking in front of a crowd. It was about staying true to himself and letting his creativity shine. He didn't need to change who he was to be heard. His art could communicate his feelings, ideas, and dreams just as clearly as words could. From that day on, Ethan kept pushing himself to share more of his work. He started writing short pieces to go along with his sketches, adding a little bit of his voice through words as well. He didn't have to shout to be noticed. He just had to be authentic and brave enough to put himself out there. Ethan learned that finding his voice was a journey, and it didn't mean he had to become someone he wasn't. It simply meant that he could express himself in his own quiet, creative way. His voice was soft, but it was powerful. And for the first time, Ethan felt truly heard. Chapter 8. The Friendship Thread. Ethan had always found it easier to be alone. He liked the quiet, the space to think, and the freedom to do things at his own pace. But ever since he met Lily, things started to change. Lily was everything Ethan wasn't: outgoing, confident, and full of energy. Despite their differences, they became fast friends. Lily didn't mind that Ethan was quiet. In fact, she respected it. She understood that some people just needed more space to open up. One day, Lily invited Ethan to something he would never have gone to on his own: a community art workshop. It was a big event where local artists gathered to create and share their work. Ethan was unsure. The idea of being surrounded by so many people made him anxious. What if he didn't fit in? What if no one cared about his art? He felt like backing out, but Lily's encouragement kept him going. "Come on, it'll be fun," she urged. "You don't have to talk to anyone if you don't want to. Just bring your sketchbook and create. That's what matters." Ethan wasn't sure what to expect, but Lily's words gave him the courage to go. When they arrived at the event, he immediately felt out of place. The room was filled with artists chatting about their work, their voices buzzing in the air. Ethan stood by the door, looking for a way to blend into the background. But Lily wasn't going to let him hide. "Come on, Ethan. Let's find a spot," she said with a grin. She led him to a quiet corner where a few people were already drawing, their attention focused on their sketches. Ethan set down his things and took a deep breath. It wasn't so bad here. No one was forcing him to talk. The room was filled with people, but it felt peaceful, almost like everyone was in their own little world. For the next few hours, Ethan sat in the corner with his sketchbook, letting the peaceful atmosphere wash over him. He sketched without thinking too much, creating a scene of a forest filled with strange creatures. It was a world of his own making, where he could disappear and just focus on the pencil in his hand. He noticed Lily from time to time, drawing next to him, but they didn't need to speak. The quiet bond of friendship between them was enough. As the day went on, Ethan began to feel more comfortable. He realized that he didn't have to be loud or outgoing to fit in. His art spoke for itself. People would stop by his corner to look at his drawings, and some even asked him questions about his ideas. While Ethan didn't enjoy the long conversations, it felt good to share his passion in a way that felt natural for him. By the end of the workshop, Ethan felt proud of himself. He had stepped out of his comfort zone, and it wasn't as hard as he thought. He wasn't the loudest person in the room, but he didn't need to be. He had his art and Lily's quiet friendship, and that was enough. The workshop helped Ethan realize that friendships didn't have to be loud and attention-grabbing. Sometimes they were quieter, built on understanding and shared moments. He and Lily didn't need to talk constantly to be close. Their friendship was strong because they respected each other's differences, and that respect gave their bond a unique depth. Ethan's journey with Lily showed him that true friendships could be like threads, delicate but strong, connecting people without needing to be seen. Even in the quietest moments, there was always room for someone who understood him. Chapter 9. The Talent Show. Ethan had never thought of participating in the school talent show. It was always something for the more outgoing students, the ones who could sing, dance, or tell jokes. He felt completely out of place when it came to these types of events. The thought of standing in front of a crowd filled him with dread. But this year, something was different. Lily had been encouraging him to try something new. She knew that Ethan had a special talent for drawing, and she believed he could do something amazing if he shared his art with others. At first, Ethan wasn't sure. How could he showcase his talent in front of an audience? He wasn't comfortable speaking or performing like the other students. But Lily kept reminding him that his art could tell a story without him needing to speak. She suggested he do a live drawing performance, something that would allow the audience to watch his creative process unfold right in front of them. After much thought and a few deep breaths, Ethan agreed. He decided to create a large drawing on stage, illustrating a scene from one of his favorite stories. He would use markers and pencils to bring the story to life as the audience watched. The idea felt safer than performing in a traditional way, as it allowed him to stay true to himself and his quiet nature. Still, the thought of being on stage made his heart race. On the night of the talent show, Ethan felt a wave of nervousness wash over him. His palms were sweaty, and his stomach twisted with anxiety. He stood backstage, holding his art supplies, wondering if he had made a mistake. The other performers were practicing their songs and dances, and the noise in the gymnasium felt overwhelming. But then Lily found him and gave him a reassuring smile. "You've got this," she said. "Just focus on your art and let the drawing speak for itself. No one's expecting you to be anyone else but you." Ethan nodded, taking a deep breath. He walked onto the stage with his drawing board and markers. The spotlight felt bright and harsh, and the audience seemed much larger than it had from behind the curtains. But once he set up his materials and began to draw, something magical happened. As his pencil touched the paper, Ethan felt a sense of calm wash over him. The room seemed to fade away, and he was lost in his work. He started sketching the characters from his story, each line and stroke bringing the scene to life. The audience was silent, watching his hands move with careful precision. Ethan was focused entirely on the drawing, and for the first time, he didn't feel afraid of the crowd. As he added the finishing touches to the illustration, the audience began to murmur in appreciation. Ethan could feel their attention, but it wasn't as scary as he had imagined. In fact, it felt reassuring. He had created something that mattered, something that spoke to people without him needing to speak at all. When he finished, there was a moment of silence, and then the audience erupted into applause. Ethan stood there, surprised and humbled by the reaction. He had done it. He had stepped out of his comfort zone, and instead of being judged or criticized, he was celebrated for who he was. The talent show wasn't about loud performances or flashy tricks. It was about showing up and sharing something real. That night, Ethan realized something important. He didn't have to change himself to fit in or be noticed. His quiet way of creating had its own power, and he could connect with people in ways he had never imagined. The talent show was more than just a performance. It was a moment of self-discovery. Ethan was proud of himself for embracing his talent and showing the world that being quiet didn't mean being invisible. Chapter 10. Embracing the Quiet Glow. By the time Ethan reached the final chapter of his journey, he had learned a lot about himself. He was no longer the shy, quiet boy who tried to avoid attention. Over the course of the story, he had grown and learned how to embrace his introverted nature in a way that made him feel proud. The quiet glow inside him had started to shine brighter than ever. In the beginning, Ethan felt like there was something wrong with him for being introverted. He thought that to be successful or happy, he needed to be louder and more outgoing like everyone else around him. But after all his experiences, his time in the treehouse, his friendship with Lily, and his success with his artwork, Ethan began to realize that his quietness was not a weakness, but strength. Throughout his journey, Ethan had learned that being an introvert meant he could observe the world in ways others couldn't. He noticed details that people who were always rushing around might miss. His quiet, thoughtful nature allowed him to connect deeply with his art and with the people he cared about. Instead of seeing his introversion as something to hide, he started to see it as a part of who he was, a gift that made him unique. Ethan also understood that being introverted didn't mean he had to stay in the background forever. It didn't mean he had to hide away from the world. What it meant was that he needed to find his own way of interacting with others. He didn't have to speak loudly or be the center of attention to make an impact. His art spoke for him. It shared his thoughts, his feelings, and his stories in ways words never could. It was his quiet way of communicating with the world. One of the most important lessons Ethan learned was that he didn't have to change to fit in. The world didn't need him to become someone else. It needed him to be himself. His quiet nature didn't make him any less valuable or less worthy of love and respect. In fact, it made him special. People started to notice the depth and care in everything he did, whether it was his art, his writing, or even his way of listening to others. Ethan's friendship with Lily also played a big part in his transformation. Lily had always encouraged him to step out of his comfort zone, but she never pressured him to be anyone other than himself. She taught him that it was okay to be quiet, that being an introvert didn't mean he had to be lonely or isolated. Instead, it meant he could form deep, meaningful connections with others, connections based on understanding and respect, not loudness. By the end of the story, Ethan understood that his introversion was not something he had to hide. It was a part of his identity, and it was something he could be proud of. He had found his voice, not through loud speeches or performances, but through the quiet, powerful glow of his creativity and the way he made a difference in the world. He knew that sometimes the quietest people have the most to offer. Ethan's story is a reminder that everyone has their own way of shining. It's not about how loud you are or how many people notice you. It's about being true to yourself and embracing the quiet glow that comes from within. Final chapter: The Quiet Glow. As the years passed, Ethan's quiet glow only grew stronger. He had gone from hiding behind the shadows of his own insecurities to embracing the unique light he had always carried within him. What once felt like a curse, the constant need for solitude, the discomfort in crowds, the struggle to find his voice, had transformed into his greatest strength. He had learned to navigate the world in his own way, carving out spaces where his creativity and empathy could flourish. Ethan's art became more than just a personal expression. It became a way for others to understand him. His small art exhibitions began to draw crowds of like-minded people, those who, like him, had often felt overlooked or misunderstood. But when they stood in front of Ethan's pieces, they saw something profound, a reflection of their own quiet struggles, their own hidden glows. On the eve of his first solo exhibition, Ethan stood by a painting that had taken him months to complete. It was a depiction of a lone figure standing at the edge of a vast, starry sky, surrounded by darkness, yet glowing brightly with its own light. Ethan looked at the figure and realized something. It wasn't about fitting in with the world. It was about shining in your own way, no matter how small or quiet that shine might seem. As people gathered around him, commenting on his work, he no longer felt the weight of anxiety that once held him back. For the first time in his life, he stood tall in his own skin, not needing to speak loudly to be heard. His art did the talking for him. And as the evening ended, with the soft hum of quiet conversations and the gentle applause of those who truly understood, Ethan knew that his journey had only just begun. His quiet glow had found its place in the world, and in that stillness, he realized that it was enough. The world didn't need to hear him shout. It only needed him to shine.